When my son texted that he was borrowing the fake watch from my wooden box for his date night, I smiled, stood up, and opened the safe. The $10 million Rolex Bao Dai was gone. I called the police, reporting a high-value theft, and that was just the beginning of the lesson he was about to learn. Innocence can be forgiven, but disregard comes with a price. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and comment where you're watching from. Let me know what time it is where you are. The text from my son Brandon came at 6:47 p.m. on Friday while I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office. The message made me pause mid-analysis of inventory costs for the Swiss manufacturing division. Borrowing the fake watch in the wooden box for tonight. Emma loves vintage stuff. I stared at the screen, trying to process what I'd just read. Brandon was in my house, rummaging through my closet, and took a watch he thought was cheap. The problem? I don't own any fake watches. My phone buzzed again with another text. Don't worry, I'll take care of it. Just want to look sharp tonight. I knew Brandon was trying to impress his girlfriend, Emma, who loves expensive watches and has a habit of keeping things she borrows. She once kept a pair of my Cartier glasses after Brandon visited, insisting they suited her better. But this was different. I stood quickly, left the office, crossed the hallway to the bedroom where I keep my valuable possessions. I opened the closet, pulled out the wooden box hidden in a secret compartment only I knew the code for. When I opened it, the black velvet cushion inside was empty. The Rolex Bao Dai, limited edition, 18K gold, black dial, one of the rarest models ever made, was gone. I swallowed hard, my hand tightening around the phone, then opened my laptop and accessed my personal inventory database. Reference 511B, Rolex, 1952, auctioned in Geneva, current value $10 million. Brandon had just taken the most valuable watch in my collection and thought it was cheap costume jewelry. I sat motionless in the dimly lit bedroom, staring at the empty black velvet. The wooden box was untouched, no signs of tampering, no scratches, but the void where the Rolex Bao Dai should have been sat silent like an accusation. I wasn't angry, I wasn't panicked. I felt a distinct emptiness creeping into my fingertips, not because of the watch's value, but because of the truth it revealed. My son didn't know who I was. 3 years ago, on a June afternoon, I was in Geneva at a private auction hosted by Philips. It wasn't the kind of event splashed across newspapers. No red carpet, no media, just a quiet room full of calm faces, subtle nods that could spike stock prices the next morning. I hadn't planned to buy anything when I walked in, but when the Rolex Bao Dai was presented, black dial, 18K gold case, moon phase, original leather strap, I knew I wouldn't leave without it. Not because it was a symbol of luxury, but because it was the only watch that ever, a piece so rare it once belonged to Emperor Bao Dai, and the only thing that silenced the entire room when it appeared. I raised my hand for the third time as the price hit 8 figures. The auctioneer's nod came with a gavel tap as soft as breaking glass. I didn't bring anyone. I didn't tell my ex-wife, I didn't tell friends, and I absolutely didn't tell Brandon. Back in California, I didn't consign the watch to a safe deposit box. I didn't get an insurance certificate. I didn't list it in the corporate asset registry. I quietly brought it home, placed it in the velvet-lined wooden box, locked it with 2 layers of security, and stored it in the hidden closet compartment, known only to me. I never wore it, never showed it to anyone. To me, it was a symbol of a life I'd quietly built over 3 decades. No applause, no spotlight. I kept it the way I kept my privacy, meticulously, silently, completely. Brandon never asked what I did. He never wondered about my work, my business trips, my cross-time zone calls, or how I maintained our stable life without complaint. To him, I was a minimalist 60-year-old dad, wearing an old Casio, driving a 2008 sedan, eating chicken sandwiches for lunch, and occasionally forgetting my wallet at the store. He once joked that I lived like a retired schoolteacher, and I smiled. I didn't deny it, didn't confirm it. I let him believe it, because part of me wanted to know, without money, without power or glamour, would my son see me, or would he only respect what had a price tag, a title, something to compare to others? The answer was now clearer than ever. He saw the most valuable watch I'd ever owned and thought it was fake. He gave himself permission to take what wasn't his without asking. No prior text, no hesitation. He saw an item in a box and assumed that if it was mine, it couldn't be worth much. I thought I hid the Rolex for safety, but now I realized I hid it because I didn't want it seen through shallow eyes the way my son had seen my entire life for years. Not because Brandon was cruel, not because he meant to disrespect me, but because he never truly cared, never asked questions, never looked deeper than the surface. I stood, closed the box, locked the drawer, and returned to my office. But the quiet was gone. Every tick of the wall clock now sounded like a reminder. Sometimes what we cherish most is what those closest to us undervalue most, not because they don't love enough, but because they never thought it was worth asking about. I returned to the office, closed the door, and sat at the computer. My hand trembled slightly as I moved the mouse to open Langford Horology's internal secure database, the system for storing and valuing unlisted special assets. I logged in with biometric authentication and a 3-step verification code, then typed into the search bar 511B. Seconds later, the details appeared. Precise, unerring. Reference 511B, Rolex Bao Dai edition. Black dial, 18K gold case. Original leather strap, manufactured 1952. Condition, pristine, unworn, stored in temperature-controlled environment. Current value, 10,000 USD. I stared at the final line as if willing it to change. It didn't. Brandon had taken a watch worth more than his own house and thought it was fake. Worse, he was wearing it to a romantic dinner in public. I checked his earlier text from noon. Taking Emma to Alta Luna tonight. 1-year anniversary. Don't call after 7, Dad. Alta Luna, an upscale French restaurant on Westwood Boulevard. Crowded, brightly lit, filled with wealthy patrons who record every luxurious moment. Picturing Brandon in a blazer, the Rolex Bao Dai glinting under candlelight, grinning as Emma posed for a selfie, made the hair on my neck stand up. This wasn't just a risk, it was a crisis. I picked up the desk phone and dialed the priority line to Langford Horology's head of security. Reynolds, a deep voice answered after 2 rings. It's Thomas. I need a status check on watch 511B. A pause. Then Reynolds replied, That's the Rolex Bao Dai, right? Current status is held by owner at private residence, not registered for transfer. It's been taken, I said, my voice low. Not by a stranger, by my son. He thinks it's fake. Another pause. Longer. Do you want me to send personnel to the house? No, I replied. This is beyond internal scope. I hung up and grabbed my personal phone, dialing a saved contact. Detective Elias Rivera, LAPD, High Value Property Division. Rivera answered faster than I expected. Langford, what's up? I need to report a theft, I said firmly. High value, very high. I'm listening, Rivera replied, his tone serious. What's the item? Rolex Bao Dai. Reference 511B. Current value 10 million USD. Taken from private storage in my home this afternoon. I heard typing on the other end. All right, do you know who took it? Yes, I said. My son. Rivera stopped typing. You sure you want to report this as theft? Family cases can get legally messy. I looked at the computer screen, where UN listed asset, extreme value private holdings still flashed. That watch is worth more than a Beverly Hills penthouse, I replied. It's not a family heirloom, not a keepsake. It's a high-value personal asset, protected under a private inventory system, and my son took it from storage without my consent. Rivera paused. I understand. Are you pressing charges? I closed my eyes briefly, not out of hesitation, but because I knew the moment I spoke, nothing would be the same. Yes, I said slowly. This isn't a family misunderstanding. This is high-value theft. Rivera switched to action mode. Do you know where Brandon is? I forwarded the noon text. Alta Luna, 7 p.m., anniversary with Emma. Rivera confirmed the address. I'll have local units there immediately. Given the item's value, we'll treat it as a major crime. Can you be ready to verify ownership and estimated value if needed? I have all the paperwork, reference codes, Geneva valuation, and internal transaction records. Good. I'll keep you updated. And Langford, what? I've never had a call like this in my career, Rivera said slowly. A father calling the cops on his son over a watch. I looked out the window where the sunset was fading behind Pasadena's rooftops. You wouldn't understand, I said. It's not just the watch that was stolen. It's respect. At Alta Luna at 7:08 p.m., Brandon Langford sat at a table by the large glass window, one hand holding a wine glass, the other flipping the watch off his wrist, offering it to Emma with a confident smile. Try it on. I think it'll look better on you. Emma, in a wine-colored silk dress, her eyes lighting up like a kid with candy, slipped the Rolex onto her wrist, twirling it under the candlelight like she was performing a private play of elegance. Oh my God, she whispered. It's gorgeous. Brandon leaned back, proud, as if he'd done something very manly, very wealthy, unaware that the moment was ticking down. The police arrived at 7:11 p.m. 2 plainclothes officers entered through the main door, their eyes scanning the room like they were hunting a con artist at a diamond auction. They went straight to table 14, where Brandon was raising his glass to toast their 1-year anniversary. Brandon Langford? One officer asked. Brandon looked up, slightly startled. Yes? Are you wearing or in possession of a Rolex watch? Black dial, leather strap, gold case? Brandon pointed to Emma, still confused. Yeah, she's wearing it. But what's this about? Stand up immediately. This is an arrest for suspicion of possessing stolen high-value property. Brandon shot up, his chair tipping over. What? Are you guys joking? Emma sat frozen, her eyes darting between the watch on her wrist and the officers, a mix of horror and embarrassment on her face. A couple at the next table pulled out their phones to record. As Brandon's hands were pulled behind his back for cuffing, the recorder zoomed in on the Rolex gleaming on Emma's wrist. She yanked it off, placing it hastily on the table as if afraid of being labeled an accomplice. "It's fake," she shouted, face flushed. "Are you guys crazy? Who gets arrested over a fake watch?" The chaos spread like a chain reaction. Other diners started pulling out phones. Someone asked loudly, "What's going on?" Another whispered, "Heard it's a stolen Rolex. $10 million. The restaurant manager rushed over, trying to calm things down, but it was too late. Brandon, still being cuffed, tried turning to Emma. His voice panicked. "Call my dad. Call him now. Tell him it's a misunderstanding." But Emma stepped back, eyes wide. "You took this from your house? Did you even tell him?" Brandon went silent. Less than 20 minutes later, a 47-second clip of Brandon's arrest went viral on TikTok. Titled, "Rich Boy Arrested at Dinner Table Over a $10 Watch?" A local news outlet reshared it, asking, "Police overreach or a sophisticated theft from a wealthy family?" Behind the scenes, Alta Luna was in PR crisis mode. They issued a statement. "We fully cooperated with authorities. No one was harmed in the incident." Emma was separated for questioning. When asked if she knew the watch's true value, she immediately denied it. "No, I thought it was a replica. I thought Brandon just wanted to pretend to be rich for a night." One officer looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "Replicas don't have reference 511B, and they don't sit in private insurance registries valued at 8 figures. When she tried to argue, they politely asked her to stay quiet and defer to a lawyer if she had one. Brandon, meanwhile, was taken to LAPD West Division. Still in his navy dress shirt, tie askew, as the police car left Alta Luna, bystanders who never noticed him before now held up phones, snapping photos, filming, live streaming. A night he hoped would mark his maturity with Emma became the night he first understood what it felt like to be truly seen, just not the way he'd dreamed. And amid all the lenses and lights, the one thing Brandon didn't understand was why his father called the police. West Los Angeles Police Station at nearly 9 p.m. buzzed with familiar noise, ringing phones, slamming metal doors, hurried footsteps down dimly lit halls. I was escorted through a side entrance to Detective Elias Rivera's office, the man who'd taken my theft report 90 minutes earlier. Rivera, a tanned man in his 50s, had a face still as marble but eyes sharp and alert. As I entered, he stood, extending a hand. "Mr. Langford, thanks for coming so quickly." I shook his hand, my gaze drifting to the interrogation room nearby. "Where's my son?" Rivera nodded toward it. "Room 2. He's been booked, fingerprinted, and is waiting for a formal interview, but he keeps demanding to see you." I nodded. "I want to talk to him alone." Rivera opened the door, letting me enter first. Brandon sat there, shirt wrinkled, tie crooked, wrists still marked from the cuffs. Seeing me, he jumped up, chair toppling, voice trembling. "Dad, finally, please tell them the watch is fake. It's fake. I didn't steal anything." I didn't respond immediately. I walked slowly to the chair across from him, sat down, and looked him in the eyes. His eyes were red, probably more from fear than remorse. I kept my voice calm. "You think I wear fake Rolexes?" Brandon grimaced, as if the question was too absurd to answer. "Well, yeah. I mean, you never show off anything. You wear old shirts, a $20 Casio, drive that ancient Toyota. I thought you were a retired accountant. How could you afford real stuff?" I leaned back, eyes still on him. I wasn't angry, just felt a bitter mist settling in. Not because he didn't know, but because he never wanted to know. "You never asked what I do," I said slowly. "Never asked how I make a living. Never wondered why this house has no mortgage, why bills are always paid early, why I still fly internationally every month despite retiring 10 years ago." Brandon slumped back, silent. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the browser and typed www.langfordhorology.com. The website loaded with a sleek black and white showroom in Beverly Hills, and at the top, in bold, Thomas Langford, founder and CEO. I tilted the screen toward him. Brandon stared, his expression shifting. "This is real?" I didn't answer, just nodded quietly. "You're a CEO?" he stammered. "Of Langford Horology? That high-end watch company?" I nodded again. "Since 1992. Brandon's jaw dropped. "But," I thought, "you thought I was a retired old man living off savings, right? Because you never said anything. You don't dress rich. You don't live like you have money." I leaned back, my chest hollow. "Because I wanted to know if you'd care about me. Not what I own, but who I am." Brandon said nothing. He looked at me like he was seeing a stranger, or worse, someone he should have known long ago. Not for fame, but for family. "That watch," I continued, "was bought at a private auction in Geneva. I've kept it for 3 years. Never worn it, never shown it, because it wasn't meant to be shown. It's part of my private unlisted collection, and you took it to impress your girlfriend. I thought it was fake, and if it was real, you still think you had the right to take it without asking? Brandon looked down. I didn't think that far. I just wanted Emma to think I was mature, classy, knew how to pick a watch. And you thought you'd show maturity by rummaging through someone else's things and taking a $10 million item? Brandon froze. No fight left. Dad, he said softly, I'm sorry. I really didn't know. I looked at my son, not as a father seeing a child's mistake, but as a master craftsman seeing an apprentice who never truly learned. And for the first time, I saw clearly, Brandon wasn't bad. He just hadn't been taught to look deeper, and now he'd opened the door to the truth himself, unaware that beyond it, nothing would ever be the same. Brandon stared at the phone screen as if the words on it had just unveiled an entirely alien universe. You're really a CEO of a whole watch conglomerate. His voice was so soft it was barely audible, trembling between shock and shame. I locked the screen, slipped the phone into my shirt pocket, and leaned back in the chair, my eyes never leaving him. I founded the company when I was just 30, I said, my voice calm, like recounting an old story. From nothing, a small rented workshop behind a train station in Santa Ana, 3 old lathes and a first order worth $400. Everything you see now, the showroom, the international brand, client relationships spanning from Japan to Germany, started with my hands and your grandfather's old oil paint toolbox. Brandon was still in shock. But why didn't you ever say anything? For over 20 years, I had no idea. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on the table, looking straight into his eyes. Because you never asked. The air in the room grew thick. I thought you knew, Brandon stammered. I thought you just wanted to keep a low profile. I thought you hated talking about work. I gave a faint smile, but it carried no forgiveness. You didn't think anything. You just didn't care. He started to protest but stopped, as if realizing no excuse could justify his words. I leaned back, my gaze drifting to a faint scratch on the wall, where years ago I'd hung my first watch on a wooden hook, back when I was an unknown repairman. Your 16th birthday, I said slowly. I spent 2 months designing a watch just for you. Graphite dial, hand-stitched Italian leather strap, a moon phase mechanism I'd assembled by hand when I was an apprentice in Germany. I canceled meetings, scrapped a Singapore contract just to finish it for your birthday. Brandon said nothing, just stared at the table, eyes vacant. 3 weeks later, I found it under your bed, covered in dust. You forgot you even had it. Brandon buried his face in his hands, his shoulders trembling slightly. But I didn't stop. I needed to finish, not to hurt him, but to make him finally see me. I wasn't angry you forgot the watch, I said. I was sad you never understood the value of what came from my heart. You thought I gave you cheap stuff, just like you thought that Rolex was fake, just like you thought I was a poor old man living frugally with nothing worth admiring. I paused, my voice dropping to almost a whisper. You never saw me, Brandon, only the broke image you built to feel superior. Brandon looked up, eyes red, lips trembling. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, I didn't know. I nodded faintly, no longer angry, just a weary ache settling into my bones. Now you know, I said, and you'll have to learn, not just to understand me, but to understand that a person's value isn't in what they wear, but in what they've quietly built in the shadows over a lifetime. And for the first time since entering the room, I saw Brandon not just hear, but truly listen. No more defenses, no more assumptions, no more mask of a know-it-all son. Just a kid who once sat beside his father, never once asking, "What do you do every day, Dad?" The door opened, and Detective Rivera stepped in, holding a neatly clipped file, his cautious gaze sweeping over the father and son facing each other. Sorry to interrupt, he said, his voice low and even, devoid of excess emotion, but I need to lay out the current legal situation. I nodded, while Brandon instinctively sat up straighter, his face visibly paling. Rivera set the file on the table. Brandon Langford, under California Penal Code, taking property valued over $950,000, whether from family or not, is classified as grand theft, a high-level felony. Brandon's eyes widened as if he hadn't heard correctly. What? Grand theft? But I didn't mean to steal. I thought it was fake. I was just borrowing it for the night and would have returned it in the morning. Rivera didn't blink. Whether you intended to return it or not, taking a $10 million item from private storage without the owner's consent constitutes a criminal act. This isn't a minor family loss. This is a serious legal violation. The typical penalty for this is 3 to 5 years in prison. Brandon turned to me, panicked. Dad, you can't let this go that far. I'm your son. I didn't know. I thought it was just some random thing you kept in a wooden box. A fake. I didn't answer immediately. I looked at that familiar face, the face I'd held as a newborn, walked to school on his first day, taught to tie his shoes, and now saw it crumbling, facing real consequences for the first time. And no one else but him had to bear them. I didn't ask the police to do this to humiliate you, I said, my voice colder than I expected. I'm not gloating seeing you cuffed at a dinner table. But when you thought my things weren't worth asking for, you disrespected me and everything I've spent my life building. Brandon trembled. I didn't mean it like that. I raised a hand, cutting him off. You thought you had the right? Because I'm unimportant. Because I wear a Casio. Because I don't show off. Because I live modestly. You assumed everything I own is cheap, not worth noticing. That's not a mistake. That's arrogance. Rivera sat down slowly. Mr. Langford, he said, we need to know, do you want to proceed with prosecution or propose an alternative resolution? The DA's office could move forward without a formal complaint due to the item's value. But if you opt for an internal resolution with specific conditions, we'll consider it. I looked at Brandon. He wasn't speaking anymore, just breathing heavily, sweat beading on his temples. I knew he was desperately searching for an out, but there were no shortcuts, no family passes, no exemptions for ignorance. I stood, pacing a small circle in the room. I'll answer, I said, but not now. I turned to Brandon, letting a hint of the father show in my eyes for the first time. You'll have to take responsibility, one way or another. And as I said it, I knew I'd set a new milestone for this relationship, where truth, respect, and justice no longer hid behind any facade. I stayed silent for a long time after Rivera's words, my eyes still on Brandon, not as a father weighing whether to save his son from jail, but as a man assessing whether the person before him had the courage to change. Brandon sat with his head bowed, hands clasped, trembling slightly. Sweat dotted his temples, his shirt wrinkled, tie skewed. He was no longer the 25-year-old raising a glass at Alta Luna, but a boy who'd never learned the first lesson about value and consequences. I took a deep breath. I have a proposal, I said to Rivera, eyes still on Brandon. I'll agree not to press charges if Brandon works at Langford Horology for 6 months, full-time, starting at the lowest position in the workshop. Brandon's head snapped up, lips moving. What? I kept my voice steady. You'll train as an apprentice, learning every step of making a watch, from cutting metal to assembly to calibrating mechanisms. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, lunch with the machinists, taking notes, cleaning, learning to respect the process. And pay? Brandon asked, voice faint. Minimum wage, I replied without hesitation. No privileges, no perks, no one calling you the boss's son. Rivera raised an eyebrow, then nodded slowly. If both parties agree, I'll note the proposal. Instead of prosecution, a conditional restorative education program, 6 months of work, and behavioral monitoring. Brandon's eyes widened. And if I refuse? Rivera looked at him directly. The case goes to the DA, and you'll face trial within 30 days for grand theft of an exceptionally high-value asset. I said nothing more. No threats, no pressure. I just looked. Brandon swallowed hard. His nod was small, slow, reluctant, but real. I agree. Rivera jotted it down, then stood, extending a hand to me. Mr. Langford, your decision just saved your son from legal trouble. He turned to Brandon. And you? Remember, not everyone gets a second chance. Don't waste it. Many wish they had a father like him, but never do. Brandon bowed his head, almost whispering thank you. Leaving the station, I noticed 12 missed calls on my phone, all from Emma. I drove Brandon home in the familiar old car, the 2004 gray Lexus he'd once mocked as outdated and classless. The ride was silent. No music, no radio, just the hum of the engine and long red lights forcing us to face ourselves. At home, I stopped the car. As Brandon opened the door, his phone rang. I didn't need to guess who it was. He answered. I couldn't hear the other end, only saw his face shift. Surprise, confusion, trying to explain, then emptiness. Emma, he called softly. Wait, listen to me. It's not what you think. The reply I caught. You made a fool of yourself in front of the whole restaurant and social media. I don't want to be tied to someone who steals a Rolex from his own father. Then a beep. The screen went dark. Brandon stood frozen by the car door, hands still holding the phone. She blocked me, he said quietly. I said nothing. I just nodded and unlocked the house. For a moment, I no longer saw a child making a mistake, but a man losing something for the first time because of his own arrogance. And that, perhaps, was where the real lesson began. At 6 a.m. Monday, Brandon arrived at Langford Horology's workshop, not the glossy office for international clients, but the gray building behind the parking lot, where the air smelled of machine oil and hot metal. He wore an apprentice uniform, a gray canvas jacket, a name tag reading just Brandon, and a 6-month training period. The door was opened by Griffiths, a 40-year veteran watchmaker, so quiet new hires thought he was mute. He eyed Brandon up and down, then gave a slight nod. Start by wiping down the machine tables. Don't let oil touch the spindles. Brandon stepped in, cold white light casting over rows of lathes, drills, and micro-pressure gauges. The sounds were steady, Steel grinding, metal clinking softly, pencils scratching notes. No one laughed. No one welcomed him. He was just a new, unproven link. Day one was like an old documentary. Wiping machine surfaces, removing rubber pads, logging equipment codes, learning to inspect tools with a loupe, and recording inventory data. When he asked a younger machinist how to measure a strap frame, the reply was curt, "Can't be off by 0.1 millimeter. Think you can handle it?" Then he walked away. By day 3, Brandon was assigned to strap assembly, a task that seemed simple but demanded maddening precision and patience. A slight misgrind could crack Italian leather or misalign a steel frame. When Brandon set a class 0.2 millimeter off, Griffiths tapped a pencil on the table. "Wrong. Do it again. And next time, don't let me catch you working while glancing at your phone." Brandon flushed, silently starting over. No one deferred to him as the boss's son. To them, he was the young guy who didn't yet know the hardness of steel or the give of leather. A watch took over 120 hours of labor. They didn't let anyone diminish that. On day 7, Brandon was sent to the vintage archive room housing prototypes from the 80s to early 2000s, many designed by Thomas Langford in his early days. The room was quiet, cold, and pristine, like a museum vault. While cataloging row A5, he paused at a watch with a black dial, dark brown leather strap, hand-milled steel case, and a tiny engraving on the back. TL 1991 Series 1. Brandon leaned closer, his heart skipping a beat. It was nearly identical to the watch his father wore throughout his childhood. The one Brandon always assumed was cheap, too plain for anyone to notice. He carefully checked the log, confirming. Langford Series 1, Thomas Langford's first design, debuted at Baselworld 1991, limited run of 100. Current market value, $42,000 USD. Brandon froze. For the first time, he didn't just see an object, but the time, sweat, ideals, perseverance, and quiet passion of a young man who stood alone in a small workshop. And the gift that man wore wasn't for show, but to remind himself that everything valuable came from his own hands. That afternoon, Brandon stayed late at the workshop, unprompted. He re-wiped used clamps, double-checked the gauge. When Griffiths passed by, seeing him still there, he asked quietly, "Starting to see something?" Brandon looked up, nodding faintly. "Yes, I think I'm starting to understand." And for the first time, the old craftsman gave a small smile. Not big, but real. Brandon began arriving earlier each morning, not out of fear of being scolded, but to spend a few extra minutes watching veteran craftsmen wipe machine parts with soft cloths, placing tiny components on glass like arranging stars. He started to see why his father could live so simply yet never complain, never justify, never demand recognition. Every watch here, from first sketch to final assembly, was a silent testament to dedication. No need for flash, no need for fame, just right and enough. Brandon came to understand why his father wore a worn Casio with faded lettering, not because he couldn't afford a Rolex or Patek, but because after crafting thousands of luxury watches, you don't need to prove yourself by wearing them. He understood why his father drove an old sedan, why he didn't react when called a retired accountant, why he stayed quiet at dinner, letting his son ramble about mediocre pharma deals. And most importantly, why his father didn't push back when disrespected. Because for a man who built an empire from nothing, recognition didn't come from others' eyes, but from knowing who he was and what he'd created. That night, as the workshop lights dimmed, Brandon stayed at the familiar wooden table, wiping oil from tools. The only light came from a yellow glow in the far corner, where Thomas Langford was inspecting new leather straps. He rarely spoke while working, but this time, Brandon approached, sitting at the wooden chair across from him. He was quiet for a few seconds, then softly asked, "How lonely were you all those years?" Thomas didn't look up immediately. He kept threading a needle through unfinished leather, each stitch impossibly precise. After a moment, he replied, "I didn't need anyone to understand me. I just needed you to ask, but you never did." The answer held no blame, no resentment. It was like a truth long held in his chest, waiting for someone to open the door and let it out. Brandon bowed his head, hands clasped before him, voice catching. "I'm sorry," he said, "for not seeing you, for thinking you had nothing worth asking about." Thomas set the needle down, looking at his son for the first time. His eyes not those of a stern CEO or a disappointed father, but of an older man who'd stayed silent too long, waiting to see if his son would ever turn back. They sat there, two men across a generation, a gap once thought unbridgeable. No one said more, no need to say more. The wall clock ticked steadily in the workshop's quiet. Outside, the city lights began to fade, giving way to a peaceful night. For the first time in years, father and son were no longer in separate worlds. They sat side by side, no words needed, yet understanding that the most valuable thing created in that workshop today wasn't a watch, but the start of something newer, deeper, truer, a relationship. 2 months after that quiet night in the workshop, An email from the Dubai office landed in Thomas's inbox. Sender Sheikh Omar Al Maktoum, a renowned Gulf collector with over 300 rare vintage watches, including Pateks never seen on the market. The email was brief but clear. I hear you own the rare Rolex Bao Dai. If it's the reference 511B displayed at Basel 2021, I'm prepared to negotiate above $12 million. Thomas didn't reply immediately. He called Brandon to his office, placing the printed email before his son without a word. Brandon read it, then looked up at his father, brows slightly furrowed. Dad, you want to sell? Thomas just nodded, saying curtly, You'll handle this deal, start to finish. Brandon's eyes widened. Me? A deal over $12 million? Thomas replied, What better way to test if you truly understand the value of what you once thought was fake? And so, in the weeks that followed, Brandon stepped into a new world, not the workshop or steel grinding tables, but closed-door meetings, encrypted calls, and triple-secured email servers. He had to prepare authentication documents for the Rolex Bao Dai, Geneva auction records, original photos, exclusivity certificates, component inspection reports, and storage history from day one. He worked with legal advisors on post-transaction confidentiality clauses, ensuring the buyer wouldn't disclose the price without permission. He reviewed bilingual English-Arabic contracts, reading every line on taxes, ownership rights, and compensation conditions. The signing took place at Langford Horology's Beverly Hills office. No media, no champagne. Just two Dubai representatives, Brandon, Thomas, and lawyers from both sides. Before signing the $12.4 million contract, the Dubai representative, Mr. Hassan, turned to Thomas, asking in a low, polite tone, For an item this valuable, I need to know who's ultimately responsible for the product's quality. The room went quiet for a few seconds. Thomas didn't look at the contract or the lawyer, but turned and pointed to Brandon. Him. Hassan slowly shifted his gaze to Brandon, raising one eyebrow. Brandon stood, bowing slightly, unwavering. I'm responsible for every component, every inspection step, and every certificate in this dossier. If anything is inaccurate or faulty, I'll personally answer for it, financially and reputationally. Hassan studied him, searching for any trace of arrogance behind the confidence. There was none, just certainty, humility, and a newly formed belief in himself. Hassan smiled. Then we trust you. The deal was signed. A week later, the Rolex Bao Dai reference 511B left California on a private jet, with dual Swiss bank insurance and armed escort to a private Dubai vault. But the greatest value wasn't in the bank account, now $12 million richer. It was in how Thomas looked at his son leaving the meeting room that day. Head high, shoulders no longer hunched with insecurity, eyes no longer panicked by a mistake. Brandon walked like a true craftsman, and the only heir Thomas never thought he'd have. The day Brandon officially took on the role of product manager at Langford Horology, the entire ground floor of the Beverly Hills office was recarpeted, not at his request, but a decision by the operations team, like a ritual to welcome a generational shift. With 47 employees working there, from veteran designers to young operations graduates, Brandon was no longer the son who stole a Rolex, but someone learning to carry his father's nearly 30-year-old dream. On his first morning, entering the main conference room as the true heir, Brandon dressed simply, a light gray dress shirt, no tie, holding the ballpoint pen he'd used throughout his 6-month training. He passed the reception desk, where he'd once sat waiting to apologize to his father, now a place where people gave a slight nod. Morning, Brandon. He didn't take the head of the table, as Thomas once did. He chose a seat in the middle, where listeners and messengers sit. When invited to speak, Brandon stood, opening the first slide, an image of the Langford Series I, the first watch Thomas designed in 1991. I started here, he said, his voice not loud or showy, but steady. I once thought it was junk not worth keeping. I was wrong. In the corner of the room, Thomas watched quietly through the glass, not as the active leader anymore, but as a father stepping back from the stage, letting the spotlight fall on his successor. He didn't interrupt, didn't edit slides, didn't review the speech. Since the Dubai deal, he'd begun handing over major decisions, first finance, then product strategy, and finally senior staffing. Each time Brandon made a choice, Thomas didn't interfere, only listening and occasionally nodding if it made sense. Though he'd stepped back from weekly meetings, Thomas still visited the workshop some days, sitting at his old table, tapping lightly on an unfinished mechanical watch, to remind himself that not everything should vanish when a new generation begins. One late weekend afternoon, father and son sat in the office behind the showroom, where the light was softer and no one else was working. Brandon was reviewing sketches for a 30th anniversary watch, his face focused. Thomas stood behind, holding a warm cup of tea. You don't need to be a copy of me, he said gently. Brandon turned, slightly surprised, but didn't interrupt. Thomas looked at the design and pointed to a detail on the dial. You added a new element, a 5-degree offset on the hour hand. The company's never done that, but it works. I think it's beautiful. Brandon gave a small smile. I wanted the first watch I oversee to be different. Not to prove myself, but to tell the story of how I took a different path, yet still head in the same direction as you. Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder, squeezing lightly. I don't need you to do everything like me, just to understand why I existed. Why every watch was made, every crown turned, every screw tightened, every contract signed, was my way of telling the world that beauty can come from silence and persistence. Brandon nodded, and in that moment they were no longer two men with clashing views of life, but two generations extending the same thread of time. Neither replaced the other, but both knew they stood in the right place at the right time, like gears in a finely crafted Langford watch. No competing ticks, just quietly working to keep time moving. New York City glowed with lights at night. Outside the Langmore Hotel on Fifth Avenue, a line of luxury cars stretched along the red carpet, while inside the ground floor was transformed into a watch exhibition, like a contemporary art gallery. Fashion reporters, horology experts, and VIP guests gathered for the launch of the new collection, Langford Legacy Line. It was the first collection since Brandon officially became product manager, and his first public appearance as Langford Horology's heir after the Rolex scandal that once stirred headlines. Brandon stepped onto the stage in a tailored black suit, no tie, collar slightly open, a confident yet understated style. Behind him, a large LED screen gradually revealed close-ups of the collection. Gears in motion, light reflecting off sapphire crystals, engravings so precise they seemed visible only under a microscope. In the silence after the opening applause, a reporter from Horology Insider stood and asked, "What did you learn from the Rolex scandal? Being judged by the world for a family mistake can't have been easy." The room went quiet. The stage lights illuminated Brandon's face. No evasion, no unease. He gave a small smile, nodded, and answered, "I learned that you can't truly understand a watch's value if you've never scraped your hands cleaning its machinery. I learned that time isn't just what you read on a dial. It's what you live with, fail with, fix with, and grow with." He paused, then said his final line, voice full of emotion. "And most importantly, never underestimate the value of the person who taught you what time is." In the front row, among executives and international guests, Thomas Langford sat quietly. No one noticed him immediately, not because he wasn't famous, but because he never craved attention. Today he wore no classic suit, no badge, no gold cane like other luxury industry moguls. He just sat there, hands clasped, watching his son stand tall on the path he'd once walked. But for the first time, the most striking thing about him wasn't his sharp gaze. It was the watch he wore. A brand new Langford, laser-etched blue dial, hour hand offset by 5 degrees, Brandon's signature design, inspired by the 1991 Series 1, and under the transparent caseback, a small hand-engraved inscription, "To the man who showed me time, BL." The launch ended with prolonged applause and offers from global distributors. But for Thomas, no contract mattered as much as the moment he saw Brandon step off the stage, walk straight to him. No introductions or guides needed. They just looked at each other, and Thomas, with a proud smile, raised his wrist slightly, showing off the unannounced watch. Brandon chuckled softly. "You're wearing it already?" Thomas replied. "First time. And the first time I don't need to hide it." Outside, New York grew late, but the Langford father and son stayed long in the backstage area. They didn't talk about stock prices or media. They talked about the next design, about ideas for a watch that could track breaths instead of seconds, about blending classic mechanics with AI to read the wearer's emotions. They spoke like two craftsmen discussing something bigger than the brand, a thing called legacy. And this time, it wasn't a secret. It was a watch born from trust, between two men once strangers in the same house, and now through time they had found each other. In today's American society, where a person's value is often equated with appearance, titles, or what they flaunt on social media, the story of Thomas and Brandon Langford reminds us of the danger of assumptions and silence in family relationships. Brandon, like many young people today, underestimated his father, who lived simply, drove an old car, and wore a Casio. Unaware that he was the CEO of a luxury watch conglomerate, owner of a $10 million Rolex Bao Dai, Brandon's unauthorized taking of the watch, thinking it was fake, not only triggered a serious legal issue but exposed a deep gap in their generational connection. A father who quietly dedicated his life and a son who never asked, "Who is my dad really?" Only when Brandon faced the consequences and worked 6 months at minimum wage in his father's company did he begin to understand value lies not in appearances but in the effort, love, and resilience of the creator. The lesson for modern Americans, especially in a consumerist, fast-paced society, is to slow down and truly see the people closest to you. Don't wait for a crisis to realize you never knew the most important person in your life. A small question, a deep conversation, could be the start of changing everything. If you believe true value sometimes hides behind silence, hit subscribe to not miss these heartfelt stories. Thank you for joining us. See you in the next video, where time isn't just counted by a watch's hands,